Okay, let's go. Number 1. Karahan Tepe. The year is 2023. You're an archaeologist working a low hill in southeastern Turkey, in the dry country east of Sanliurfa, and you are brushing dirt away from the top of a stone pillar that has been buried for 11,000 years. The soil comes off in careful strokes, and then the stone looks back at you. Cut into the pillar, in raised relief, is a human face. Deep-set eyes, a heavy brow, a broad flattened nose, staring out of the rock with an expression that has been waiting in the dark since before farming existed. The site is called Karahan Tepe, and it is the reason the story of civilization is quietly being rewritten right now, while most people are not looking. Karahan is part of a cluster of sites in these hills that archaeologists call the Tas Tepeler, the Stone Hills, and its far more famous sister sits about 22 miles away. That sister is Göbekli Tepe. Together they are the oldest monumental architecture anyone has ever found. Karahan Tepe was built around 11 to 12,000 years ago. Rooms cut down into the living bedrock, rows of tall T-shaped pillars, a chamber where columns rise out of the floor, carved to look like a crowd of human heads, and, announced just recently, that pillar with a human face, the first of its kind ever found. Here's where it gets strange, and it is the same strange fact that Göbekli forced on the world a few years earlier. The people who built this had nothing they were supposed to need. No farming. They were hunter-gatherers, and Karahan Tepe went up before anyone in the region planted a field. No pottery, no writing, no metal tools, no wheel. By every rule in the textbook, a scattered population of foragers should not be able to quarry, carve, and raise monumental stone temples, organize the labor, feed the workforce, and decorate the pillars with a confident, artistic style. That is supposed to come thousands of years later, after cities, after agriculture, after everything. And here it is, first, at the very bottom of the human story, already finished. The textbooks say civilization starts about 5,000 years ago, in Sumer. At least, that is the story, right up until you stand in front of something twice that age that should not exist. 20-ton pillars, carved faces, sacred rooms cut into rock, made by people who had not yet invented the idea of planting a seed on purpose. Karahan Tepe is sophisticated and deliberate, the oldest thing of its kind we have ever dug up, and there is nothing rough or experimental about it. And the more they dig at Karahan, the stranger it gets. In one chamber, a row of tall pillars stands carved out of the bedrock, and set into the wall above them is a human head in stone, watching the room, with a carved snake seeming to slither toward it. The builders shaped the living rock itself into figures and faces and pillars, hauled and raised T-shaped megaliths, and laid the whole thing out with intention, across a landscape now dotted with a dozen related sites, the Stone Hills, all of them from the same impossibly early moment. This is a whole culture, an entire building tradition, not one freak building, sitting thousands of years before the tradition is supposed to begin. And then there is the detail that this entire video comes back to at the very end. Karahan Tepe was not simply lost to time. Like its sister Göbekli Tepe, which its own builders deliberately buried, filling the whole complex in with rubble and walking away, the Tas Tepeler sites were covered over and abandoned. The reason we are digging them out of the ground at all is that someone put them into the ground on purpose, and the burial is the only reason the carvings survived 11,000 years, looking freshly cut. So hold on to the question that hangs over every other discovery on this list, because we are going to answer it, and the answer changes the shape of history. Why does the oldest, deepest evidence of organized human culture keep turning up thousands of years earlier than we are told it should exist, and then keep turning up hidden, buried, sealed? Or, as you will see by the end, underwater. Something is wrong with the timeline we were handed, and the pattern of where the evidence is found is the clue to what? Halfway around the world, high in the mountains of South America, another wall answers the first half of that question in stone. It is built from blocks, the weight of houses, some of them up to 200 tons, and they are fitted together so tightly that you cannot slide a sheet of paper into the seam between them. No mortar, no gaps. And no engineer alive today can tell you for certain how those stones were cut and set into place. Number 2. Sacsayhuaman. You're standing above the city of Cusco, in the Peruvian Andes, at the foot of a wall that does not look like it was built so much as grown. It runs in a long zigzag across the hillside, and it is made of stone blocks, but not the tidy rectangular kind you stack like bricks. These are enormous, irregular, many-sided boulders, some of them taller than you are, the largest weighing somewhere between 120 and 200 tons. And where one giant block meets the next, the two shapes lock together like pieces of a puzzle cut by the same hand. You run your fingers along the seam, looking for the gap. There isn't one. You could not slide a sheet of paper, or a knife blade, into the joint. This is Sacsayhuaman, and it is one of the great unsolved problems of stonework on Earth. And these blocks have all been shaped. Each polygonal stone has been cut with a dozen or more faces and angles, and every one of those faces matches the block beside it exactly, curving and interlocking in 3 dimensions, with no mortar holding any of it together. To do that, you cannot just quarry a rough block and drop it in a wall. You have to shape each stone to fit its specific neighbors, on all sides, to within a hair, while the stone weighs as much as a house. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The official explanation is that the Inca did it by hand, and the Inca were genuinely brilliant builders, so let's take that seriously. The method archaeologists reconstruct is brutal and slow. Mark where 2 stones touch. Swing the multi-ton top block out of the way, pound down the high spots with harder hammerstones. Lower the block back, check the fit, mark the new contact points, lift it away again, and pound some more. Dozens of cycles, for a single joint, on a single stone, and there are thousands of stones. Even if that is exactly how it was done, it describes an investment of labor and precision that is almost impossible to imagine, on blocks so heavy that lifting one out of the way and lowering it back over and over is its own engineering miracle. And there is a reason all that effort was worth it, a reason that turns Sacsayhuaman from a mystery into a warning about how much these builders understood. The walls are earthquake-proof. The Andes are violently seismic, and rigid stone walls with mortar crack and collapse when the ground moves. Sacsayhuaman does not. The mortarless polygonal joints let the blocks shift and settle and rearrange themselves during a quake, then lock back into place because the complex interlocking angles stop them from sliding apart. In 2010, an earthquake hit Cusco and cracked modern buildings across the city. The Inca walls did not move. The design is pure engineering, built to survive the specific way the earth breaks in that place, and it has worked for centuries. And there is the transport problem sitting underneath all of it. These blocks did not grow where they stand. The stone was quarried and moved to the site, and some of it came from miles away, across broken mountain terrain, at high altitude, by a people with no iron tools, no wheels, and no draft animals strong enough to haul 200 tons. Down in Cusco itself, in a wall the Inca built from the same tradition, there is a single famous block cut with 12 separate angles, each one locking precisely into the 12 stones around it. 12 angles, on one stone, fitted perfectly on every side. That is the work of people who understood stone at a level we struggle to reproduce even now, with power tools and cranes. There is one more thing that gets whispered about at Sacsayhuaman, and it is the same thing whispered at every megalithic site in the Andes. The Inca themselves did not always claim the oldest, largest, most precise walls. In their own accounts, some of this monumental stonework was already ancient when they arrived, built by people who came before, and the Inca simply repaired it and built their own smaller, rougher work on top. Stand at the wall, and you can see the split with your own eyes. The colossal, impossibly fitted foundation stones at the base, and then, above them, the neater but cruder later masonry. They do not look like the same hands. It is as if a people inherited a wall they could not have built and did their best to add to it. The next builders did something quieter, and in its own way just as impossible. They reached into a hill of solid granite, hollowed out a room, and then polished the inside of the bare rock until it shines like a mirror and rings like a struck bell. And to this day, nobody can fully explain how you mirror polish the inside of a granite cave with no metal to do it. Number 3. The Barabar Caves. You're deep inside a hill of solid granite in eastern India, in a chamber that someone carved out of a single piece of the rock, and the walls are so smooth that when you raise your lamp, you can see your own face looking back at you out of the stone. Not polished the way a countertop is polished like glass, like a mirror. Run your hand across it and there is no grain, no tool track, no seam, just a hard, cold, flawless surface curving up and over your head, cut into one of the most difficult stones on Earth. These are the Barabar Caves, and they are the oldest surviving rock-cut caves in India, carved in the 3rd century BC during the Mauryan Empire, under the Emperor Ashoka and his grandson Dasharatha. They were made for a group of ascetics called the Ajivikas. Each cave was hollowed out of the living granite by hand, and then the interior was given what art historians call the Mauryan polish, a mirror finish so fine and so even that it has survived more than 2,000 years underground without dulling. And here's the genuine problem. Nobody is fully sure how it was done. This is a real, standing question in the study of ancient technology, not fringe speculation. Granite is brutally hard. To grind it to a mirror finish, you need an abrasive nearly as hard as the granite itself, applied with even pressure across a large, curved surface, for an enormous length of time, without leaving a single low spot or scratch that would break the reflection. Doing that on a flat slab is hard enough. Doing it on the inside of a domed chamber, in the dark, on a concave wall over your head, to a standard that still holds a reflection 23 centuries later, is a level of stone finishing we cannot fully reconstruct. If a granite room built to shine like a mirror has you leaning in, subscribe before number 4, because the pattern underneath all 10 of these is about to show its hand. Because the polish is not even the strangest thing about Barabar. The strangest thing is what the rooms do with sound. The chambers are small, sealed and lined with that dense glass-smooth rock, and the effect is that they are acoustically alive in a way an ordinary room is not. Speak inside one, or hum a low note, and the sound does not just echo, it catches. The whole chamber picks it up and holds it, ringing, the note sustaining and rolling around the curved stone long after you have stopped making it. Historians who have studied the caves think this was not an accident, that the builders shaped and finished the interior specifically to turn the room itself into an instrument, a space where a chanted syllable would fill the stone and come back at you changed. There is a clue to how much this mattered to the builders carved into the entrance of one of the caves, the one called Lomas Rishi. The doorway is cut to imitate wooden architecture, curved beams and a lattice reproduced perfectly in solid granite, as if the masons wanted to prove they could copy anything in the hardest stone there is. And the caves were carved into whaleback domes of raw granite, not a soft hillside, but some of the most stubborn rock in India, which is exactly the stone that should make a mirror polish impossible. Whoever did this chose the hardest available material and then finished it to the highest possible standard on the inside of a sealed room and left almost no clue as to how. A mirror finish on granite. That is the kind of tolerance that makes modern stonemasons put their tools down and go quiet. Now put the two facts together, the impossible polish and the deliberate acoustics, and what you are standing in stops being a cave and starts being engineering. Somebody in the 3rd century BC, and quite possibly working from techniques much older than that, understood how to finish the hardest stone to an optical standard, and understood how a sealed chamber of that stone would behave when you filled it with sound, and combined the two on purpose. This will not be the last time on this list you watch people bend hard stone to a purpose we can barely reconstruct. The next builders worked on a scale that makes even this look modest. They raised pillars of solid granite, the weight of 100 tons each, hauled them 500 miles across the desert, and then sank them far below the floor of an Egyptian temple, standing in a chamber ringed by water like an island. And the archaeologist who dug them out of the ground said something that got very quietly buried in the literature, that this was not the pharaohs' work at all, but something far, far older. Number 4. The Osirion. You're at Abydos, one of the most sacred sites in all of ancient Egypt, standing behind the great temple of the pharaoh Seti I. The temple in front of you is covered in the most exquisite carved reliefs in Egypt, painted, detailed, signed with the names of kings. But that is not where you are going. You are climbing down, because the structure you came to see sits far below the temple's floor, sunk into the earth behind it. And when you reach the bottom, you are standing in a hall of enormous, bare granite pillars rising out of still, dark water. This is the Osirion, and it does not look like anything else at Abydos. The temple above it is refined, decorated, unmistakably New Kingdom Egyptian. The Osirion is the opposite. It is built from colossal blocks of rose granite, some of the pillars weighing around 100 tons apiece, quarried at Aswan, and somehow moved 500 miles down the Nile to get here. And the pillars are plain. No carving, no inscription, no painted reliefs, no royal names, none of the decoration the Egyptians put on everything they were proud of. Just raw, massive, precisely cut granite, standing in a chamber deliberately surrounded by water so that the central platform sits like an island. Here's where it gets strange. Mainstream Egyptology dates the Osirion to Seti around 1300 BC and interprets it as a symbolic tomb, a cenotaph to the god Osiris. But look closely at how that date was actually arrived at. It rests very heavily on one fact. The Osirion sits right behind Seti's temple, so it is assumed to belong to Seti's building program. Proximity. That is the core of the argument. And it runs straight into the stones themselves, because bare, colossal, uninscribed granite is not how the pharaohs of that era built. They signed their work. They covered it in text and image. They did not haul 100-ton blocks 500 miles and then leave them utterly blank. The archaeologist who excavated the Osirion in the early 1900s noticed this. Her name was Margaret Murray, and she was no fringe theorist. She was a serious Egyptologist working alongside Flinders Petrie. And when she looked at the size of the blocks, the complete absence of decoration, and the raw, cyclopean style of the construction, she concluded that it pointed to great antiquity. She wrote that the Osirion was of an even more archaic character than another structure long considered impossibly old. In plain terms, the person who dug it up thought it was far older than the temple standing in front of it, and older than the pharaohs it was later assigned to. If she was right, then the pattern from the first two sites repeats here in the Egyptian desert. A later, well-documented culture builds next to, and takes ownership of, a piece of monumental stonework that a much earlier people actually made. The pharaohs did at Abydos what the Inca may have done at Sacsayhuaman. They inherited something enormous and ancient, and they built their own signed, dated, decorated work around it, and history gave them the credit for the whole thing. The construction itself is on a scale that fits Murray's instinct. The great roof slabs and lintels that once covered the hall are enormous, single blocks of stone spanning the gaps between those 100-ton pillars, cut and fitted with the kind of cyclopean confidence you see in the very oldest megalithic work and almost nowhere in the delicate, decorated architecture of the temple standing above it. And there is one more oddity. On some of the granite, faint markings have been found, including a design of overlapping circles that people call the flower of life, etched into the hard stone by a hand, and a purpose no one has firmly explained. And notice the one detail the builders clearly cared about most: water. The Osirion was engineered so that its central chamber is permanently surrounded by groundwater, an artificial island in the dark, below the level of everything else. Whoever built it went to enormous effort to reach down to the water table and put the sacred heart of the structure in the middle of it. Hold that image, water at the center of the oldest thing on the site, because water is the thread this entire list is pulling toward, and by the end you will understand why the deepest, oldest work keeps ending up in it. The next discovery leaves stone behind completely. It is a set of human teeth, 9,000 years old, from a town in what is now Pakistan, and every one of them has been drilled, a clean, round hole bored straight into a living tooth, thousands of years before there was supposed to be anyone on Earth who could do such a thing, which forces a question the textbooks would rather skip. Who was practicing dentistry in the Stone Age? Number 5. Mehrgar. You're an archaeologist on the Kachi Plain in Baluchistan, in western Pakistan, and you're holding a human molar that came out of a grave 9,000 years old. You turn it over in the light, and you go still, because there is a hole in it. Not a cavity, not the ragged pit that decay leaves. A hole, round, clean, straight-sided, drilled deliberately into the crown of the tooth by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And this is not the only one. Out of the graveyard at this site, 11 teeth like it have come up, from 9 different people. Somebody at Mehrgar, 9,000 years ago, was drilling human teeth. The site is called Mehrgar, and it is one of the most important and least famous places in the human story. It was a farming town, occupied from around 7000 BC, and it is essentially the seedbed of everything that came after in the region, the deep root of the great Indus Valley civilization that would rise thousands of years later. The people here were early farmers, growing wheat and barley, herding cattle, sheep, and goats, and they were already skilled workers of copper. They lived in mud brick houses. They made pottery and figurines and jewelry from shell and turquoise. By the standard of 9,000 years ago, this was a sophisticated, settled, technically capable community, but it is the teeth that stop everyone cold. Here's where it gets strange. When a team led by the researcher Roberto Macchiarelli examined those drilled molars under a microscope, the precision was almost impossible to believe. The holes are cleanly circular, ranging from about a 1/16 of an inch to a bit under an eighth of an inch across, and drilled up to an eighth of an inch deep into the tooth, and they worked out the tool. The holes were made with a tiny flint drill point mounted on a bow drill, the same kind of drill these people used to bore beads, spun fast against the tooth. Experimental archaeologists tried to reproduce it and found that a skilled operator could drill a hole like that in a living tooth in under a minute. Under a minute. This is functional dentistry, aimed at the biting surfaces of the back teeth, exactly where decay and pain concentrate, performed 9,000 years ago, roughly 4,000 years before the earliest dentistry anyone previously knew about. The real question is where a Stone Age village learned to do this, and why we only found out by accident. Because nobody set out to discover the origins of the dentist's drill. The teeth just came up out of the ground with the rest of the burials, and it took close microscopic study to realize what those clean round holes actually were. Think about what the practice implies. To drill a tooth on purpose, someone had to understand that the pain came from the tooth, had to develop a tool fine enough and controlled enough to bore into it without shattering it, had to hold a frightened, hurting human being still, and had to do it fast enough to be bearable. That is medical knowledge. That is a specialist skill, refined and passed on in a farming village at the very dawn of settled life. And it fits the shape of everything on this list. Not monumental stone this time, but the same lesson pointed at the human body. Sophisticated, precise, transmitted knowledge, showing up thousands of years before we are told anyone could possibly have had it. We picture the people of 9,000 years ago as barely hanging on, scraping a living from the dirt, primitive in every way. And here they are, drilling each other's teeth with a bow drill, fast and clean and on purpose, and we only know because we happen to look closely at what came out of their graves. So the count keeps climbing, and the pattern keeps holding. A temple before farming, walls we cannot fit, granite an excavator called impossibly old, and now the oldest dentistry on earth, 4,000 years early, done by farmers in a town most people have never heard of. Mergar is 9,000 years old. The next discovery is 3,000 years older than that. It is a carved wooden statue, once standing as tall as a house, its surface covered in human faces and in long rows of symbols that look, for all the world, like writing. And nobody, in more than a century of trying, has ever been able to read a single line of it. Number 6. The Shigir Idol. The year is 1890. You're a gold miner in the Ural Mountains of Russia, working a peat bog, and the peat keeps handing you pieces of old dark wood. You almost throw them back, but they are carved, shaped, covered in patterns. And when the pieces are laid out and fitted together, they form a figure, a tall wooden idol, blackened and preserved by the acids of the bog, its surface covered in human faces and hands, and rows of strange geometric marks, staring up out of the ground where it had lain for longer than anyone could imagine. This is the Shigir idol, and it is the oldest monumental sculpture on earth. It is carved from a single trunk of larch, and today it stands about 9 feet tall, though when it was whole, before parts of it were lost, it may have risen to something like 17 feet, taller than a house. It is covered, front and back, in deliberate carving, far more than a simple post. Human faces with open, hollow eyes look out from top to bottom. There are hands, and there are long bands of zigzags, chevrons, and geometric symbols running the length of the body, arranged in a way that is clearly meant to say something. For over a century, nobody understood how old it was, and the answer, when it finally came, broke the timeline. Early attempts guessed it was a few thousand years old. Then, in 2018, scientists used accelerator mass spectrometry, a precise radiocarbon method, on the wood itself. The Shigir idol is around 12,000 years old. 12,000. That makes it twice as old as Stonehenge, twice as old as the Egyptian pyramids. It was carved near the end of the last ice age by hunter-gatherers, people with no farming, no cities, no writing that anyone has ever recognized as writing. And this is a monument, taller than a house, not a small personal carving, raised and displayed by people we are told had none of the things you need to make such a thing. Twice as old as the pyramids, which, looking back, is a sentence the textbooks really did not want to be true. Because a monument means organized effort, a shared belief worth the labor, an artistic tradition mature enough to produce something this confident and this complex. And here it is, at the very bottom of the human story, in a Siberian bog, made by foragers thousands of years before civilization is supposed to begin. It is the same shock as Karahan Tepe, in a different material. Foragers with none of the supposed prerequisites made the oldest monumental art on Earth, thousands of years before the textbooks say it was possible. And then there is the part that genuinely unsettles the researchers who study it: the symbols. Those rows of geometric marks carved down the body of the idol are structured, repeated, and arranged with intention, not random decoration. And some scholars believe they carry encoded meaning, a message, a mythology, a system of information set down in wood by a megalithic mind. But nobody can read them. In more than 100 years, no one has deciphered what the Shigur idol is saying. We are looking at a deliberate, structured symbol system carved 12,000 years ago, and it is completely silent to us. The people who made it knew things, and wanted to record them, and did, and the record has outlasted the ability of anyone to understand it. So sit with what that means for the story we tell about ourselves. 12,000 years ago, before the first farm, before the first city, before the first line of what we call writing, someone in the Urals carved a monument as tall as a house, covered it in faces and in a symbolic language, and stood it up. The knowledge, the art, the organization, and possibly the writing were all already there. At the very beginning, in the hands of the hunter-gatherers, we were taught to think of as simple. These people did more than carve. They kept time. The next discovery is a row of 12 pits, dug into a field in Scotland by hunter-gatherers, that everyone walked past for decades as nothing, until someone worked out what the pits were counting and realized they were looking at the oldest calendar ever found anywhere on Earth, thousands of years before anyone was supposed to be tracking the turning of the year. Number 7. The Warren Field Calendar. You're standing in a quiet field near Craith's Castle, in Aberdeenshire, in northeast Scotland. There is nothing dramatic to see. Just a stretch of grass, and, marked out in the soil, a row of 12 shallow pits running in a gentle arc for about 165 feet. For decades, nobody thought much of them. Old holes in the ground, maybe storage pits, maybe nothing. Then a team of archaeologists worked out what the 12 pits were actually counting, and the field turned out to hold the oldest calendar on Earth. The pits at Warren Field were dug around 8000 BC and used for thousands of years after. That makes them roughly 10,000 years old. And they are not random. When a team led by the University of Birmingham studied the arrangement, they found that the 12 pits appear to represent the 12 lunar months of the year, their shapes and sizes mirroring the phases of the moon as it waxes and wanes. And the whole arc is oriented so that it aligns with the sunrise on the midwinter solstice, the shortest day. In other words, it is a device for tracking the lunar months and correcting them against the solar year, so the calendar does not drift. That is a lunisolar calendar. It is genuinely sophisticated timekeeping. Here is what makes it break the timeline. This calendar predates the first known formal calendars of the ancient Near East, the ones from the early civilizations of Mesopotamia, by nearly 5,000 years. 5,000 years. And it was built by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, not a city or a priesthood or a literate state. Foragers. The exact people the textbooks describe as living hand-to-mouth, following the herds, with no time or need for abstract knowledge. Those people dug a working astronomical calendar into a Scottish field 10,000 years ago and maintained it across generations, tracking the moon and the sun with enough care to keep the year from slipping. 7 discoveries in, and every single one of them is thousands of years older than the story we were all taught. Subscribe before we go further, because the last 3 are the ones that finally explain where all of it went and what happened to the world that made it. Because think about what a calendar actually means. You do not build one by accident. To lay out 12 pits that track lunar months and lock to the solstice, you have to have watched the sky for a very long time. You have to have noticed that the moon cycles about 12 and a bit times for every trip the sun makes through the year, understood that the mismatch will throw your count off, and engineered a physical correction for it. That is patient, cumulative, transmitted knowledge, the kind we associate with settled, organized societies. And it is sitting in a Stone Age field in Scotland, made by hunter-gatherers, 5,000 years before anyone was supposed to be doing anything like it. The way it was found tells you how easily something like this hides in plain sight. Nobody digging on the ground noticed it. The site was first spotted from the air, as a faint pattern of marks in a field photographed from an aircraft, and only when archaeologists excavated the pits from 2004 onward did the arrangement start to make sense. And the cleverest part is the correction built into it. A calendar based only on the moon drifts out of step with the seasons within a few years, because the lunar months do not divide evenly into the solar year. Warren Field solves that. The whole arc of Pitts is aligned to the sunrise on the midwinter solstice, so once a year, on the shortest day, the builders could stand at the right spot, watch the sun rise in its notch on the horizon, and reset the count. It is a self-correcting lunisolar calendar dug into the earth thousands of years before Stonehenge, which by comparison is a recent monument. So add it to the pile. Monumental temples before farming, precision stonework we cannot match, Cyclopean granite an excavator called impossibly old, dentistry drilled into living teeth 9,000 years ago, a carved monument twice the age of the pyramids, covered in symbols no one can read, and now, the oldest calendar on Earth, kept by foragers. None of these is supposed to exist. All of them do. And the more of them you stack up, the harder it becomes to keep calling each one a strange exception, instead of seeing them for what they are together, which is the fingerprints of a human past far older and far more capable than the official timeline admits. Everything on this list so far has been on dry land, above the tide line, where you can walk up and touch it. That changes now. The next discovery is a whole village, houses and hearths, and a stone circle built around a freshwater well, with 65 people still buried where they were laid to rest. And every bit of it is standing, right now, on the floor of the sea. Number 8. Atlit Yam. This one you have to dive to reach. You're off the coast of Israel, near a town called Atlit, just south of Haifa, and you drop down through the Mediterranean to a sandy seabed about 40 feet below the surface. And laid out on the bottom, in the green light, is a village. Stone foundations of houses, hearths where fires burned, a well, streets. People lived here, an entire community, 9,000 years ago. And then the sea rose and swallowed the whole thing, and the sand sealed it like a lid. The site is called Atlit Yam, and it is one of the best preserved drowned settlements ever found. It dates to the Neolithic, somewhere around 7,000 to 6,300 BC, and because the seabed covered it so gently, it survived in a way land sites almost never do. Archaeologists diving it have found the stone foundations of houses, fireplaces, tools, fishing gear, and the bones of the animals these people kept, and the fish they caught. They found a freshwater well the villagers dug. And they found the people themselves. 65 human skeletons, still lying where they were buried, so well preserved that researchers pulled the oldest confirmed DNA evidence of tuberculosis in human history out of a mother and infant buried together. And at the center of the village, there is something that stops every archaeologist who sees it. A stone circle. 7 large standing stones, each weighing up to half a ton, set upright in a freestanding ring around the mouth of that freshwater well. This is a deliberate megalithic monument, a circle of standing stones, built around water, at the heart of a village that is now on the floor of the sea. The people who raised it farmed, they fished, they built houses and dug wells, and this ring of standing stones was theirs too, made for reasons we can only guess at, and all of it went under. And somehow it gets stranger, because of that well. The well at the center of Atlit Yam is a freshwater well. Someone dug down through the ground to reach fresh drinking water, and built the sacred stone circle around it. Which tells you something absolute about the timing. When those people dug that well, the sea was not here. This was dry land, well back from the coast, far enough inland, and high enough that fresh groundwater sat below it, and the salt sea was somewhere out beyond the horizon. The village was built on a coast that no longer exists, on dry ground, and then the water came for it. There is even a theory about the exact moment it drowned. Atlit Yam covers a huge area of seabed, around 10 acres, and it was buried fast and clean, the way a site is sealed by a sudden event rather than a slow creep. One leading idea is that the final blow was a tsunami, triggered when a flank of the volcano, Mount Etna, collapsed into the Mediterranean and sent a wall of water across the sea to the coast, burying the village under sand in a matter of hours. Whether it was a single wave or the steady climb of the sea, finishing a village already at the waterline, the result is the same. A thriving Neolithic community, with its wells and its stone circle and its dead, went under and stayed under for 9,000 years. That is the detail this whole list has been circling toward. Atlit Yam is not a city that flooded in a storm. It is a piece of a coastline that the rising sea permanently erased. And it did not go under because of anything unusual about that one spot. It went under because, at the end of the last ice age, the sea was climbing everywhere, up and up, decade after decade, century after century, reclaiming the low coastal land all around the world where people had settled. Atlit Yam is simply one village, in one shallow spot, that we happen to find, sealed under the sand with its dead still in place and its stone circle still standing. And if the sea could take a whole village and hide it 40 feet down until 1984, when it was finally discovered, then the obvious question is, how much more is down there? The answer is the next discovery, and it is not a village. Atlit Yam is one drowned settlement. The next one is a drowned country, an entire landmass the size of a nation, under the North Sea, where fishing boats to this day haul up carved spear points and the bones of the animals its people used to hunt. Number 9. Doggerland. You're on a fishing trawler in the middle of the North Sea, 100 miles from any coast, dragging a net across the bottom in the cold gray water. The net comes up heavy, full of the usual catch, and tangled in it is something that makes the whole crew go quiet. A spear point. A barbed harpoon, carved from antler, shaped by a human hand around 10,000 years ago. You are 100 miles out to sea, and you are holding a hunting weapon, made on dry land, by someone who walked across the ground beneath your boat when it was not the bottom of the ocean but a country. That country has a name now, Doggerland. 10,000 years ago, the North Sea did not exist as it does today. In its place was a vast, low, fertile plain, over 70,000 square miles of it, connecting what is now Britain to the Netherlands and Denmark as one unbroken stretch of dry land. You could have walked from Yorkshire to Denmark without ever seeing the sea. And this was some of the best land in the region. No empty wilderness, rolling hills, river valleys, marshes and lakes, teeming with fish and birds and game, and it was full of people. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived across Doggerland, following the rivers, hunting the herds, building camps on ground that is now under 100 feet of cold salt water. For a long time, nobody took it seriously, because you cannot excavate the bottom of the North Sea. But the evidence kept coming up in the nets. Stone tools, bone harpoons, the bones and tusks of the mammoths and lions and deer that lived there. And then the science caught up with the fishermen. Using seismic survey data collected by oil companies drilling the North Sea, researchers have been able to map tens of thousands of square miles of the drowned landscape, reconstructing Doggerland's ancient rivers, hills, and coastlines in detail, an entire lost country charted from the shape of the buried ground. They have even found preserved human footprints on the seabed. This is accepted, mapped, mainstream geology and archaeology, not a theory. There was a country here, and the sea took it. And we know how it ended, which is the part that should raise the hair on your arms, given everything else on this list. Doggerland did not just slowly sink. As the Ice Age ended and the sea climbed, the land shrank year by year, the coastlines creeping inward, until Doggerland was a smaller and smaller island. And then, around 6150 BC, a colossal underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, called the Storegga Slide, sent a tsunami across the North Sea. Waves over 20 feet high tore across the low remaining land and drowned what was left of it, and the people on it, in a single catastrophe. A whole inhabited world, wiped off the map by water, and remembered by no one, until the trawlers started pulling its tools up out of the deep. And this is not new evidence, which is what makes it so striking that it took so long to accept. Back in 1931, a fishing trawler working the North Sea dragged up a lump of peat, and inside it was a beautifully carved antler harpoon point, thousands of years old, from the bed of the open sea. It sat as a curiosity for decades, an impossible object from the middle of the ocean, until the science of Doggerland finally caught up and explained it. The harpoon was dropped, or left, on dry land, by a hunter standing on ground that the sea had not yet claimed. The proof of the drowned country had been sitting in a museum for most of a century before anyone was ready to believe the country had existed. That was only round one of what the sea has been hiding. Because Doggerland is the North Sea's drowned country, and it is not the only one. Every continent has a Doggerland. All around the world, the same rising sea that swallowed this plain, swallowed the coastal lowlands of every landmass, the exact places where people cluster most thickly, then and now. Doggerland is simply the one we have mapped, because it happens to lie under a shallow sea that the oil industry spent decades surveying. Every discovery on this list has raised the same question, and none of them has answered it. Where did the world that built all of this go? Karahan Tepe, the impossible walls, the oldest calendar. Where is the civilization that could do these things? The last discovery answers it, and it was only found in 2024. A wall, deliberately built, running for most of a mile, as old as the very first site on this list. And it is sitting in the dark, right now, on the floor of the Baltic Sea. Number 10. The Blinker Wall. The year is 2021. You're a geologist on a research ship in the Baltic Sea off the northern coast of Germany, and you are not looking for anything ancient at all. Your team is mapping crusts of manganese on the seabed, running sonar back and forth across the bottom of Mecklenburg Bay. The instrument pings the floor, over and over, drawing its shape on the screen. And then the screen draws a line. A long, straight, deliberate line of stones on the seabed, running on, too straight and too regular to be an accident of nature. You have just found something nobody knew was there, under 70 feet of cold Baltic water. They called it the Blinker Wall, and when the discovery was published in 2024, it stopped archaeologists cold. It is a wall, a deliberately built structure, made of roughly 1,670 stones, running for about 3,200 feet along the seabed, close to 2/3 of a mile. Smaller stones set carefully in a line, linked by larger boulders, laid out by human hands. And it was built on dry land, beside the shore of an ancient lake, around 11,000 years ago, by Stone Age hunter-gatherers, long before any sea reached the spot. Its most likely purpose was as a drive wall, a low barrier to funnel herds of reindeer along a set path so that hunters waiting at the end could take them. It is one of the oldest and largest man-made structures ever found in Europe. The whole thing was found by accident, which is worth sitting with. Nobody was looking for a Stone Age megastructure. A team of geologists was surveying the seabed for something completely unrelated, and the wall just happened to fall under their instruments. They were able to date it because it runs right alongside the drowned shoreline of an ancient lake, and the youngest phase of that shoreline is around 9,000 years old, which means the wall, built on dry ground beside the water, is older still, raised before the sea ever reached it. And it is not a one-off oddity. On the other side of the world, under the waters of Lake Huron in North America, divers have found almost the same thing. Long lines of stones, laid out by Ice Age hunters to funnel caribou, now drowned under a freshwater sea. The same idea, the same age, the same fate, on two different continents. Wherever the water rose, it took the record of the people who had been standing there. Now hold that date against the very first thing on this list. The Blinker Wall is around 11,000 years old. Karahan Tepe is around 11,000 years old. They are the same age. At one end of this list is a monumental temple in the hills of Turkey, and at the other is a mile-long wall on the floor of the Baltic Sea. And they were built at the same moment in the human story, by people the textbooks call simple foragers. One survived because it was inland and got buried. The other survived because it sank, and the cold Baltic preserved it in the dark. And that is the answer this entire list has been building toward. The reason the oldest evidence of us keeps turning up too early, and keeps turning up buried, sealed, or underwater, is not a mystery, and it is not a coincidence. It is water. When the last ice age ended, the ice sheets that had locked up the world's water melted, and the sea rose by around 400 feet. Not overnight, but relentlessly, over thousands of years, the ocean climbed and swallowed the coasts. And the coasts are where people live. Then and now, human beings crowd onto the shorelines, the river mouths, the low, fertile plains at the edge of the sea. When the water rose 400 feet, it drowned all of it. That is why the Blinker Wall, and Doggerland, and the village at Atlit Yam are underwater. They were on the coasts and the lowlands of the Ice Age world, and the sea took them. And they are only the shallow edge of it, the parts that happen to sit in water divers and sonar can reach. The heartland of that early world, the densest, richest coastal settlements, went down far deeper, off every coastline on the planet, where almost nobody has ever looked. What survived on dry land is only the high ground the water never reached. The temple in the Turkish hills, the granite hall at Abydos, the idol in the Siberian bog, the calendar in the Scottish field, the pieces high enough or deep enough inland to escape the flood. Everything else, the coastal core of it, is on the bottom of the sea. We are not the first ones to build. The evidence has been staring at us the whole time, in temples older than farming and monuments older than cities and calendars older than kings. We are the ones who built on the high ground, the second time, after the water took the rest. And the strangest part is how much of that first world is still down there, in the dark, under 100 feet of water, off coasts no one has surveyed, waiting for someone to go and find it. So tell me, down in the comments, which of these 10 you would dive on or dig up first if you could, and where in the world you are watching from. And if you want to keep finding out what the sea is still hiding, subscribe.